There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from explaining too much. It is the exhaustion of the person who spent 20 minutes composing a two-sentence reply, who wrote a paragraph justifying why they couldn't attend something, then deleted it, then rewrote it, then added another sentence of apology, then read the whole thing 4 times before sending it, then worried for the rest of the day that it still wasn't enough. It is the exhaustion of the person who said no to something they had every right to decline, and then spent the next 3 hours mentally defending that decision to an imaginary audience that never asked for a defense. It is the exhaustion of the person who, before every difficult conversation, rehearses. Not the conversation itself, but the justification, the case they need to build, the evidence they'll need to present. They lie in bed the night before, running through it, anticipating objections, preparing responses to objections they haven't even received yet, constructing an argument so thorough, so carefully reasoned, so preemptively airtight that surely, no one could find fault with it. And then they deliver it, and they watch for the reaction. And even when the reaction is acceptance, even when the other person nods and says they understand, there is no real relief, just a brief reprieve before the next situation that requires a case to be built. This is the life of someone who cannot stop explaining themselves. And what almost no one tells them, what they rarely discover on their own, is this. The explaining isn't communication. Most of the time, it is a request, a very sophisticated, very exhausting, entirely unconscious request for permission. Permission to make that choice. Permission to have that preference. Permission to exist in the specific way they exist without someone finding it unacceptable. And the tragedy is not that they explain. The tragedy is that no amount of explaining ever quite delivers the permission they're looking for. Because the permission they need cannot come from the outside. It never could. But most people spend years, sometimes entire lifetimes, discovering this the hard way. Think about the last time you explained a decision you had already made. Not a complex decision, not a decision that affected other people. A simple, personal, entirely yours decision. What you ordered, where you wanted to go, why you'd chosen this over that. And as you explained it, some part of you was not describing. Some part of you was defending, building a case, watching the other person's face for signs of approval or judgment. That gap between describing and defending is where this entire conversation lives. Notice the people around you who don't do this. They make a decision and they move. They say no and they don't elaborate. They express a preference without framing it as something that requires external validation. They hold a position without immediately scanning the room for permission to keep holding it. They don't seem to need the verdict. And something about this registers as unusual, as confidence, as composure, as something you cannot quite name but can immediately feel. The question worth asking is not how they became so confident. The question is, what did they stop needing that you still need? Because this was never really about confidence. It was always about permission. Look at how this shows up in daily life. Because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like being a thoughtful communicator. It feels like consideration. It feels, in many cases, like the responsible thing to do. A woman accepts a job offer after months of deliberation. When she tells her parents, She doesn't just share the news. She delivers a prepared case. The salary, the growth potential, the reasoning behind turning down the other offer. She has anticipated their concerns and answered them before they're asked. She watches their faces as she speaks. She is not sharing something she's excited about. She is asking for a verdict on a decision that has already been made. A man sets a boundary in a friendship. He tells his friend he can't be the one everyone calls at 2 in the morning anymore. He needs that sleep. He has reasons. He has thought about this for months, and when the moment comes, he doesn't simply state the limit. He builds a case around it. He apologizes for having the need. He softens every sentence. He watches for the shift in his friend's energy. He will spend the next week wondering if the friendship survived it. He has every right to need sleep. He did not need a trial. But somewhere inside him, having a need, particularly a need that might inconvenience someone else, feels like something that requires justification before it's allowed to exist. A young woman at work disagrees with the direction her team has taken. She believes it is the wrong call. She has data. She has reasoning. But when the moment comes to speak, she prefaces her disagreement with so many qualifications. So many I might be wrong, and I know I haven't been here as long, and you probably know better than I do, that by the time she reaches the actual point, she has already undermined it. Not because the point was weak, because she didn't trust that she was allowed to make it. These are not isolated habits. They are a pattern. And the pattern runs through relationships, workplaces, families, social situations, even the small private moments when nobody is watching, even the way someone talks to themselves, even the arguments they rehearse in the shower for conversations that may never happen. The question worth sitting with is, where did this start? Because nobody is born over-explaining. Nobody arrives into the world feeling like their choices require a defense before they're valid. Something teaches that. Something, some environment, some relationship, some repeated experience early enough in life that it felt less like a lesson and more like reality. Teaches a person that their existence, their needs, their decisions require justification before they're acceptable. Go back far enough and you will almost always find one of a few things. You will find a home where love was conditional, where warmth arrived when you performed well, behaved correctly, made the right choices, produced the right emotional response in the people around you, and cooled, subtly or dramatically, when you didn't. Where the child learned quickly, the way to maintain safety is to be justifiable, to always be in a position where your behavior can be explained and approved. The child in that home becomes very articulate, very good at anticipating objections, very skilled at building cases for their own existence. They grow up into adults who are exhausting to watch because they cannot simply move through the world. They have to argue themselves through it. Or you will find a home with someone unpredictable in it, a parent whose reactions couldn't be reliably mapped to cause and effect, who was calm about large things and explosive about small ones, who approved something Monday and rejected the identical thing Friday. And the child, trying to survive emotionally in that environment, developed an extraordinary sensitivity to the variables. What is the mood? What is the current threshold? What case do I need to build today? That child becomes an adult who studies people before speaking to them, who reads the room compulsively, who adjust their explanation based on who they're explaining to, because somewhere in them the belief runs, the explanation has to be calibrated. The wrong explanation to the wrong person is dangerous. Or you will find something quieter. A home not obviously damaged, parents who weren't cruel, but who criticized frequently, who had an opinion on every choice, who asked in a tone that was half question and half verdict, why would you do that? Not as genuine curiosity, as disapproval wearing the costume of a question. The child in that home learns that having a different preference is something that requires defense, that wanting something other than what is expected is a position you need to justify. Not occasionally, every time. And they carry that internal interrogator into adulthood, where it continues asking the same question about everything. Why would you do that? And they feel compelled to answer, even when no one is asking. There is a specific kind of person who appears perfectly functional in every visible way. They have a career. They have relationships. They are pleasant and capable and liked by almost everyone who meets them. And they spend an enormous amount of their interior life in a courtroom. Every decision has a hearing. Every preference is cross-examined. Every choice, before it is acted on, while it is being acted on, and after it has already been made, goes through a process that looks, from inside, like consideration, but is actually something else. It is prosecution. They are not deciding what they want. They are determining whether what they want is defensible, not whether it is right, whether it can be justified. And the distinction between those two questions, what do I want versus what can I defend, is where a person's authentic life slowly gets replaced by a performed one. A man in his late 40s has a successful career in a field he entered because it made sense to everyone around him at the time. He has never told anyone that he finds it hollow. Not because people wouldn't listen, but because the act of saying it out loud would require defending it. And to defend the hollowness, to explain why someone with his position and his salary and his stability could possibly have a complaint, feels like a case he cannot win. So he doesn't bring it to trial. He keeps the question locked in the room inside him where the uncomfortable things go. He goes to work. He performs competence. He explains himself when required in terms everyone approves of. And at 50, he will look up from that life and feel a distance between himself and it that he cannot entirely account for. A sense that he was there for all of it and somehow missed it, because he never fully chose it. He approved it. There is a difference, and the difference accumulates. Now think about something that almost never gets examined, the specific psychological function that explaining serves. Because it is not random. It is not accidental. There is something it gives the person who does it, something that, in the short term, in the moment, feels like relief. When you explain yourself thoroughly, when you build the case, when you lay out the reasoning and the context and the extenuating circumstances and the alternatives you considered, for that moment you feel briefly protected. You have removed the ammunition. You have closed the gaps. You have made it harder for someone to judge you because you've already addressed all the ways they might. It is armor, constructed in real time, out of words. The problem with armor made of words is that it is never finished. There is always one more objection to preempt, one more concern to address, one more angle that hasn't been covered, And so the explaining continues and continues and gets more elaborate with time. And here is the strange and painful irony. The more you explain yourself, the more uncertain you appear. Not to you, to everyone watching. Because certainty doesn't need a lengthy defense. When someone makes a decision from a place of genuine security, they don't build a case around it. They state it, and then they stop. The length of the explanation is often inversely proportional to the confidence behind it. Think about the person who orders food at a restaurant and immediately justifies the choice to the table. Who explains why they didn't get what they usually get? Who offers context for why this felt right today? Nobody asked, nobody required this information, but they could not simply order and move on. Compare them to the person who orders, closes the menu, and rejoins the conversation. No preamble, no defense, just a decision followed by presence. The first person is not a bad communicator. They are an anxious one, specifically anxious about the verdict. And the explaining is the attempt to preempt a negative verdict before it can be delivered. But here is what no one tells them. The explaining doesn't prevent judgment. It invites it. It signals there is something here that might require judgment. Please examine it. The person who says no simply has created nothing to examine. There is a particular kind of person that shows up in everyone's life at some point. They are warm, thoughtful, socially skilled, but something about them exhausts you in ways you cannot immediately name. Something about their company requires energy in a specific direction. You notice it most when they make decisions, or rather, when they explain decisions. A man in his late 30s has been offered a promotion that requires relocating. He has decided to take it. And yet when he tells people about it, when he tells his friends, his family, his colleagues, he doesn't tell them. He defends it. He presents a case. He explains everything that went into the decision as if he is on trial and they are the jury. He watches each face. He adjusts his argument based on what he sees. When someone raises a concern, he doesn't simply consider it and respond. He becomes slightly more frantic in his explanation, more thorough, more preemptive. He adds more information, more context, more justification. He leaves every conversation feeling not like he shared news, but like he survived a hearing. And the curious thing is, not one person in his life has challenged the decision. They have been largely supportive. A few have had questions. Nobody has condemned him. But he cannot feel that, because the trial he is conducting is not happening in any of those conversations. It is happening inside him. And until he wins it there, no external verdict will be enough. This is the thing that almost nobody understands about over-explaining. It is rarely about the listener. The listener is almost incidental. They are the stand-in, the proxy, the person in front of whom the internal case is being argued. Because the real audience, the one that will never be satisfied by the explanation, is inside. It is the internalized voice of whoever first made the person feel that their choices needed defending. A parent, a teacher, a critical sibling, an environment of constant evaluation. Whoever installed the belief that simply wanting something wasn't enough. That needs required justification, that preferences were debatable. That voice is still in the room for every decision. And the explaining is aimed at it. And the explaining never quite works, because that voice doesn't grant verdicts. It only asks more questions. Here is something worth saying clearly. The habit of over-explaining is not a flaw in character. It is not evidence of insecurity in some shameful sense. It is a perfectly logical response to an environment that once demanded it. In a home where your needs had to be argued for, arguing for your needs was the intelligent adaptation. In a school where your choices were routinely questioned, building strong cases for your choices was the smart move. In a relationship where disagreement produced emotional danger, preempting every possible disagreement was emotionally rational. The strategy worked once. The tragedy is not that the strategy exists. The tragedy is how long most people carry it into environments where it is no longer necessary, into friendships that don't require it, into relationships that don't demand it, into a life that is, in fact, no longer requiring them to defend their right to exist. But the nervous system hasn't received that update, and so the explaining continues. And the cost of it, the specific, accumulated, daily cost, is something most people don't realize they're paying. Every time you explain when you didn't need to, you send yourself a message. The message is, what you decided required justification. And over time, the repetition of that message does something to self-trust. It erodes it, slowly, consistently, in the way that water erodes stone, not dramatically, just continuously. The person who cannot make a decision without explaining it externally is gradually losing the ability to make decisions internally, because the external explanation has become the final stage of the decision itself. The decision isn't complete until someone else has received it and responded, until the verdict is in, which means the decision was never actually theirs. Think about what that does to a person across years. Every decision requiring consensus, every preference requiring defense, every choice processed through the filter of how it will be received before it can be fully believed in. The self becomes, in a very real sense, committee-dependent. It cannot act alone. It cannot decide alone. It cannot rest alone. It is always waiting for external confirmation before it can settle. And that waiting, that constant background waiting for the verdict, is a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't have a name, but that many people recognize immediately when they encounter it described. It is the tiredness that sleep doesn't cure, because it is not physical. It is the tiredness of a person who has been on trial every day for as long as they can remember. Here is another cost that rarely gets named. The over-explainer often becomes, over time, someone who is very difficult to actually know. Not because they are withholding. They are not. They give enormous amounts of information about themselves. They explain, they justify, they share context, they provide background. They are often among the most verbally transparent people in any room. But what they share is not themselves. It is the case for themselves. There is a difference. The explanation is always constructed for an audience. It is shaped by what the audience might object to, calibrated for the emotional temperature in the room, designed to produce a specific reception. And so the people closest to the over-explainer often have a detailed, thoroughly documented, carefully presented portrait of them, and still feel, in some inarticulate way, like they don't quite know who they are, because they have never met the unmanaged version. A woman has been in a close friendship for 6 years. Her friend is generous, warm, frequently communicative. They talk often. They share a lot. But the woman has noticed something she cannot name for a long time. Every time she is with her friend, she senses a performance. Not a deceptive one, not a cold one, a careful one. Her friend is always presenting a version of herself that is slightly assembled, always monitoring, always watching for how things land. And the woman, who genuinely loves her friend, finds herself sometimes feeling oddly lonely in their conversations. Even the long ones, even the warm ones. She eventually understands why. She has never seen her friend drop the case. She has seen the managed version, the justified version, the pre-approved version, the version that was constructed to be receivable. She has never seen the thing underneath. And neither, probably, has her friend. Because the explaining, which began as protection, has become the wall. Now here is a contradiction worth sitting with for a moment. The people who explain themselves the most are often the least guilty. Think about that. The person who builds the most elaborate case for a decision they made, who adds context, who preempts objections, who apologizes proactively, who layers qualifier upon qualifier, is very often doing all of this not because the decision was wrong, but because they believe that wanting something requires a level of justification proportional to how guilty wanting it makes them feel. Guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing. For some people, guilt is the automatic response to having a need, to setting a limit, to choosing themselves. It is not a signal that something unethical occurred. It is a residue, a learned feeling, a trained emotional response to the act of taking up space. And the explaining is the behavior that guilt generates. So the more elaborate the explanation, the more guilt. And the more guilt, the less the person has actually done wrong. They have simply done something that, somewhere in their emotional history, became associated with requiring justification. Meanwhile, the person who has actually done something they should feel guilty about, they rarely over-explain. They dismiss, they deflect, they minimize. They do not build 40-sentence cases for their innocence. Because the elaborate case is not built from guilt about wrongdoing. It is built from anxiety about being seen as wrong. Those are completely different things. A woman takes a Saturday for herself. No particular reason. She is tired. She wants to rest. She cancels the plans she had made loosely with a friend for that day and sends a message explaining why. And then she reads it back before sending and adds 3 more sentences. An apology, a rescheduling offer, an acknowledgement of how much she values the friendship to preempt any sense that the cancellation implies otherwise. She sends it, and then she waits. When the friend replies, warmly, easily, saying no problem at all, the woman feels relief. Brief, real relief. But notice what just happened. She needed a Saturday, a single Saturday of rest. And to access it, she required external approval. She could not simply take it. She had to make a case for it, and she could not feel at peace about it until the case was accepted. She will do this again next time, and the time after that. The Saturday was hers. It was always hers. But she couldn't quite reach it until someone else confirmed it was okay. Now consider a different person in the same situation. She sends a message. It says, "Hey, I'm going to take Saturday for myself. Let's reschedule." She does not explain further. She closes the phone and makes tea and does not think about it again. The difference between these two people is not their relationship with their friend. It is not their fundamental nature. It is not even their level of care for others. It is their relationship with their own authority. The first woman does not yet believe fully that her needs are self-authorizing. She believes they require external permission before they become valid, and so she generates the document, the explanation that she hopes will grant that permission. The second woman has, somewhere along the way, moved the permission-granting function from outside herself to inside. She does not need the verdict, she has already given it. And here is where the word confidence comes in, because this is what most people mean when they say someone is confident, even if they would never describe it this way. They don't mean the person is bold, or loud, or fearless, or dominant. They mean the person is not asking for a verdict on their choices, not asking for permission to have preferences, not asking for confirmation that who they are is acceptable enough, not performing for a jury, just moving through the world from their own center. And this absence of constant asking is what registers as presence, as gravity, as the quality in certain people that makes you lean in when they speak and feel in their company. The particular ease of being around someone who is not trying to manage your opinion of them. There is no manipulation in it. There is no deliberate withholding. They are simply not consumed by the question of how they are landing, because they have already, in some private and permanent way, landed. Most people believe confidence develops through achievement, through success, through building an external record impressive enough to justify internal peace. And there is partial truth in this. Success can provide evidence. Evidence can quiet the anxious mind temporarily. But observe closely enough, and you will notice that the people who are truly internally grounded, who genuinely don't seem to require the external verdict, did not get there through achievement. Many highly successful people are among the most compulsive over-explainers in the room. Their accomplishments did not cure the need. Nothing external ever quite does. And this is worth examining carefully. Because the belief that achievement will eventually produce security, that if you build enough, earn enough, prove enough, you will finally stop needing to justify yourself, is one of the most quietly consuming traps available to an ambitious person. A woman has spent 15 years building a career that would impress anyone who looked at it from the outside. And in many ways, it does impress her too. She is genuinely proud of what she has done. But she has noticed something that confuses her, because it should not be this way, given everything she has accomplished. She still explains herself, constantly, to her family, who she outgrew years ago, but whose opinions still carry an emotional weight that defies logic, to colleagues who have less experience than she does, to people she barely knows in conversations that will not matter in a week. She still builds the case, still watches for the reaction, still feels the specific anxiety of a decision that hasn't yet been approved by someone outside her. And the confusion she feels is this: I have done so much. Why is this still here? The answer is because the two things are not connected in the way she assumed. The accomplishments address the question of whether she is capable. They did not address the earlier question, the one installed before she was old enough to understand it, the one that asks not whether she is capable, but whether she is allowed, whether she is acceptable, whether she is, without the performance, without the credentials, without the case, enough. That question is older than any achievement, and it does not respond to achievements. It responds only to something quieter and more personal, to the accumulated experience of having existed simply without apology, without a case, without the verdict. Which is why the person who has done the least impressive things by external measure and somehow possesses genuine internal peace is paradoxically further along than the high achiever who is still performing for an audience that has long since left the room. The shift is different. It is quieter, and it happens inside. A man has spent years as a people pleaser, not a visible one, not obviously, but structurally in the way his life is arranged. He says yes to things he doesn't want to do. He explains his no's in elaborate detail. He shapes his opinions around the room before offering them. He monitors reactions. And one day, not dramatically, not because of a single event, he simply gets tired of the weight of it. He sets a boundary without explanation. He declines something without apology. He states an opinion he knows will be unpopular, without the usual row of qualifiers around it, and he waits for the consequences, for the relationship to break, for the disapproval to arrive and be as unbearable as he always believed it would be. And the disapproval comes, some of it. Not everyone is comfortable with the new version of him. Some people push back. Some people respond with the cold shift in energy that once would have sent him into days of backtracking. But something is different. He is okay, not because the disapproval doesn't sting. It does. Not because he doesn't prefer approval. He does. But because the sting is survivable. Because the disapproval, when it arrived, was not the catastrophe he had built it into in his imagination. It was just a feeling. Heavy for a while, and then lighter. And in that discovery, in that small, ordinary, privately enormous discovery, something fundamental changed. The threat was survivable. And once you know the threat is survivable, you stop organizing your entire life around avoiding it. This is the shift that the word confidence is trying to name, but rarely succeeds in describing accurately. It is not fearlessness. It is the discovery that the fear was overestimating the danger. Now here is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath all of this. Over-explaining does not protect you from judgment. It amplifies it. Because judgment, real judgment, the kind that happens in other people's minds about you, is not primarily responsive to the cases you build. It is responsive to your energy, to how you hold yourself, to whether you seem to believe what you're saying. And the person who explains at length, who qualifies and apologizes and preempts and hedges, is signaling through the very structure of their explanation that they are not sure they're allowed to have what they're defending. And other people pick up on that signal immediately, even when they can't articulate what they're sensing. The person who states their position and stops is signaling something entirely different. They are signaling this is simply what is. There is no verdict pending. I am not awaiting your ruling on this. And people respond to that differently, not always positively. Some people will be unsettled by it, particularly people who are used to having leverage over the explainer. But there is a respect that emerges, a recognition of something solid. The ironclad explanation earned through length and thoroughness rarely generates that recognition. The simple statement, undefended, often does. A woman tells her family she has decided not to come home for the holidays this year. She has her reasons, personal ones. She has explained them before, in previous years, in different forms, and the conversations have always been long and difficult and unresolved. This year, she does something different. She calls. She says, "I'm not going to make it this year. I love you. Let's find another time to connect." She does not explain. She does not defend. She does not preempt the objections she knows are coming. The objections come anyway. But she holds the position, not with coldness, not with aggression, with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who has decided something and is not asking for it to be ratified. The conversation is uncomfortable. There is disappointment on the other end of the line. There is pressure. She holds, and afterward, sitting in the silence of her apartment, she feels something she did not expect to feel. Not guilt, not relief exactly, something more structural than relief. Something like self-respect. She was not unkind. She was not absent. She said she loved them. She offered to connect differently. She was present and caring, and she did not move from what she knew to be right for her. And that, the experience of holding what she knew to be right without dismantling it under pressure, produced something in her that no successful explanation had ever produced. Trust in herself. Not confidence in the showy sense, something quieter. The specific, foundational trust of a person who has learned they can hold their own weight. Let's talk about what happens in the brain of someone who over-explains. Not abstractly, specifically. When you sense that a decision of yours might be judged, when you are in the presence of someone whose opinion carries emotional weight, and you are about to make a statement they might not approve of, something activates that is older than thought. It is the part of the brain that monitors social threat, the part that was, in evolutionary terms, monitoring for the signals that meant exclusion from the group, the part that does not distinguish neatly between physical danger and social danger. To that part of your brain, disapproval feels like a warning, and the explanation is the response to that warning. It is the attempt to neutralize the threat, to reduce the probability of exclusion through thorough communication. This is not weakness. This is the human social brain doing its job. The problem is that the calibration is off. In the environment where this response was calibrated, usually childhood, usually a home where certain people's emotional reactions did carry real consequences, the threat was proportional to the response. The disapproval of a parent who withheld warmth genuinely was dangerous to a small person who needed that warmth to survive emotionally. But in adulthood, in most of the situations where the explanation reflex fires, the threat is not proportional. A colleague's skeptical reaction, a friend's mild disappointment, a family member's expressed concern. These are not survival-level threats. They are ordinary social friction. But the nervous system doesn't always update that distinction automatically. It feels the same, and so it sends the same response. Build the case, explain, make it safe. The update that needs to happen is not cognitive. It is not about understanding that you're an adult now and the old threat is gone. Understanding that does not quiet the nervous system. What quiets the nervous system is repeated experience. The experience of facing the threat, letting the disapproval arrive, and discovering that it didn't produce the consequence it once produced, that the warmth wasn't permanently withdrawn, that the relationship survived, that you survived. Each experience like this adds something to the record, a small piece of evidence that the threat has been overestimated. Over time, the record shifts, and with it, the reflex. But it takes time, and it takes a kind of willingness that is genuinely difficult. The willingness to let disapproval arrive without immediately trying to neutralize it. There is something worth noticing about the texture of that discomfort. The moment before an explanation, the brief space where you could simply not explain, has a specific feeling. It is tight. It is anticipatory. It carries the quality of waiting for something bad to happen. That feeling is data, but it is not accurate data. It is the nervous system reading the present moment through the lens of a much older experience. It is the body saying, "Last time you stood here unexplained, something dangerous happened, and you do not want to be there again." But you are not there again. You are here, in this conversation, with this person, in this life, where the consequences of being unexplained are, in most cases, nothing more than mild discomfort, a pause, an ambiguity, possibly a follow-up question, not the withdrawal of warmth that once made being unexplained genuinely dangerous. A woman at a dinner with friends is asked why she left her last relationship. She has a real answer, a true one, but it is complicated and it is hers, and she does not particularly want to share it at a dinner table. The old version of her would have either explained at length, offered the full accounting, provided the narrative, answered everything, or fumbled anxiously for a shorter version that still covered enough ground to prevent judgment. This version of her says, "It stopped working," and she moves on. And the table moves on. Not because no one was curious. One person was. But curiosity is not an obligation. And the woman has learned, slowly, across many smaller experiments, that her interior life does not owe itself to every question asked of it. She does not need to fill every silence with justification. The silence, when she lets it exist, is not an absence. It is a statement. Think about a man who has spent his professional life in meetings where he disagrees, but does not say so directly. He has opinions, strong ones. He is frequently right. His colleagues, on the rare occasions when he does offer something clearly, are often impressed by his thinking. But mostly, he doesn't offer it clearly. He offers it buried, wrapped in so many qualifications that the actual point, by the time it arrives, is almost lost. He says things like, "I could be wrong. I'm not sure this is relevant. This might not be the best way to look at it." And then, somewhere in the middle of all that hedging, the actual thought, which is usually exactly what the room needed. And after the meeting, he feels a specific, quiet frustration. Not with others, with himself. For the gap between what he thought and what he said. For the version of himself that exists in his head, direct, clear, unhesitating, and the version that shows up in the room. The problem is not that he doesn't know what he thinks. The problem is that he doesn't yet believe he's allowed to just say it. He was trained, in a home, in a school, across years, to present his thoughts as tentative offerings, as things that required permission to exist. And so even now, in a room where his opinion is genuinely wanted, he cannot simply have it out loud. He has to apologize for it first. And here is what nobody told him. The apologizing undermines the thought, not because his colleagues consciously assess the hedging and discount the thought accordingly, but because energy is legible. Certainty is legible. And when someone presents an idea while simultaneously apologizing for it, the idea arrives pre-undermined. Whatever its actual value, it lands with the weight of something that doesn't fully believe in itself. Whereas the person who simply says what they think, clearly, without preamble, without the row of qualifiers, that person's thought lands differently. Even when it's wrong, even when the room pushes back. Because the confidence of the delivery is not about the thought being correct. It is about the speaker believing they are allowed to have thoughts. Here is something that gets said often in various forms, but is worth saying precisely. Confidence is not the absence of self-doubt. Almost everyone has self-doubt. The person you assume is unafraid of judgment, the one who speaks without hesitation, who holds positions under pressure, who doesn't seem to need your approval, they have self-doubt. They have moments of uncertainty. They have preferences that feel fragile and opinions they're not completely sure about. The difference is not the absence of doubt. The difference is that they do not outsource the resolution of that doubt to other people's reactions. When they are uncertain, they sit with the uncertainty. They do not rush to explain their way out of it. They do not build a case whose primary function is to generate external reassurance. They do not wait for your verdict before they can proceed. They proceed with the doubt present, and they find out through moving whether the doubt was warranted. This is the deeper thing, the thing underneath confidence. It is the ability to tolerate the open question, to not know for certain whether you're right and move anyway, to hold the uncertainty without needing it resolved by someone outside you. The over-explainer is trying to resolve uncertainty before they move. They are trying to pre-approve the decision before committing to it. The explanation is the request for that pre-approval. The person who doesn't over-explain has learned to move while uncertain, to commit without pre-approval, to trust that they can handle the outcome, including the outcome where they were wrong. That is what makes them appear fearless. They are not fearless. They are better acquainted with their own resilience. A young woman is in a long-term relationship with someone who has always had opinions about her choices. Not cruelly. With concern, he would say, with care for her well-being. But the concern has a shape. It expresses itself as questions about her decisions. Why did you choose that job? Why do you want to move there? Are you sure about this? And the questions carry a weight that is heavier than their content. They are questions with verdicts preloaded into them. She has spent years explaining herself to him, building cases, seeking, and sometimes receiving, sometimes not, his endorsement of her choices. And one day she notices something. She cannot remember the last time she made a decision without first imagining how to present it to him. The decisions have stopped being hers. They go through him before they are fully formed. Her internal process runs automatically through the filter of how he will receive it, which means the actual question, what do I want? What do I believe is right? What feels true to who I am? Has been replaced by a different question. What will pass? And she realizes that this is not a relationship problem alone. This is a self problem. Because even in relationships where this dynamic isn't present, with her friends, with her colleagues, even with herself in quiet moments, She still runs the same filter, still processes her own preferences through the imagined reaction of an audience. The relationship made it visible, but it didn't create it. She brought this with her. And that realization, that particular uncomfortable clarifying realization, is the beginning of something important, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see, and she can see it now. Let's talk about what changes when someone genuinely stops needing the external verdict, not performatively stops, not as an exercise in appearing confident, not as a posture adopted to seem unbothered, actually stops. What changes is not that they become indifferent to other people's opinions. They notice them. They consider them. When they receive criticism, they evaluate it honestly. When they receive disapproval, they feel it. The difference is in what they do with it. A person who has moved their authority inside evaluates criticism the way they'd evaluate any input. Is there truth in this? Does this match what I know about myself? Is this worth updating on? And if the answer is yes, they update. If the answer is no, if the criticism is coming from someone whose opinion they have no reason to weight heavily, or if it reflects the other person's needs more than any actual problem with their behavior, they notice it, acknowledge it internally, and don't restructure their life around it. They are not defended. They are not brittle. They are not performing imperviousness. They are simply operating from a different center of gravity. The approval-seeking mind is centered outside itself. Every decision, every choice, every preference circles back to the question, how is this being received? Is it acceptable? Does it require modification to become acceptable? The internally centered mind asks a different question first. What do I think? What do I know to be true? What am I certain about here, and what am I not? And how do I want to move given both of those things? External input is welcome, but it arrives as information to be considered, not as a verdict to be awaited. The shift is subtle and enormous. A man receives feedback from a mentor he respects. The feedback is direct and unflattering about something in his work. His first instinct, the old one, is to explain, to offer context, to lay out the circumstances, to make a case for why the thing the mentor identified is not quite what it appears. He stops himself, not because explaining is always wrong, but because he recognizes what this particular explanation would be for. It would not be for clarity. It would not be for genuine dialogue. It would be for relief, for the brief comfort of feeling less exposed. So instead, he says, "Thank you. Let me think about that." And he does think about it, honestly, without the distorting pressure of needing to defend against it. And he discovers that there is truth in it, that the thing the mentor identified is real, that the explanation he was reaching for, while not entirely false, would have been a way of not looking at something he needed to see. The absence of explanation opened a door that the explanation would have closed. There is a specific kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It is the courage of the person who says no without elaborating, who makes a choice and doesn't circle back to justify it, who holds a position that is unpopular and lets the discomfort of that be okay, who is misunderstood by someone and doesn't immediately move to correct the misunderstanding. From the outside, this can look like coldness, like arrogance, like not caring. From the inside, it is the hardest thing many people ever learn to do, because the urge to explain, the pull of it, The almost physical discomfort of leaving something unexplained when you could explain it is real. It is a genuine, strong, conditioned impulse. And overriding it, especially in the beginning, requires something that feels like holding your breath underwater. A pressure, a duration, a waiting for the moment when the need eases. But it does ease. And each time it eases, the person on the other side of it finds something. They find that the relationship they were afraid to lose did not break because they left a boundary unexplained. They find that the colleague they were afraid to disappoint did not lose respect for them because they stated a position without apologizing for it. They find that the space they created by not explaining everything immediately, the silence they didn't rush to fill, was actually heard differently by the other person than they imagined it would be. Heard as clarity, as confidence, as someone who knows what they think. Because that is what non-explaining communicates, even when it communicates nothing else. I know where I stand. Let's talk about the hardest version of all this. The version that is easiest to intellectually understand and most difficult to actually do. Allowing yourself to be misunderstood without correcting it. For the person whose nervous system has been calibrated around managing others' perceptions of them, this is almost physically painful. To know that someone has an inaccurate impression of you, to have the information that would correct it, and to choose not to deploy it. Because you have decided that their accurate understanding of you, while something you would prefer, is not something you require. A woman says something in a conversation that gets taken out of context. She knows she said it a certain way, meant it a certain way, and it has been received differently, probably not charitably. She can feel the shift in the other person's energy. The old version of her would have immediately moved to correct it, explained the original intention, reconstructed the context, made sure the correct impression was restored. She would have done it anxiously, probably over-explaining in the process, probably making the thing more fraught by the urgency of her desire to fix it. The newer version of her sits with the discomfort. She asks herself, does this misunderstanding actually require correction? Does it affect something important? Is there genuine damage being done here that is worth repairing? Sometimes the answer is yes, and she addresses it calmly, briefly, without the anxious urgency of someone managing a threat. Sometimes the answer is no. This is uncomfortable, but it is not actually damaging anything real. The person's impression of me in this moment is incorrect. I can live with that. And she lets it go. And in the letting go, in the small, unglamorous, genuinely difficult act of allowing someone to have a slightly wrong impression of her without scrambling to correct it, she discovers something. She is still there. The misunderstanding did not diminish her. The incorrect impression sitting somewhere in someone else's mind is not eating away at who she is. She does not require that person's accurate understanding of her in order to know who she is. Her sense of herself is no longer dependent on other people's sense of her. That is the thing. That is the whole thing. And it cannot be shortcut, cannot be reasoned into, cannot be generated by reading about it or understanding it intellectually. It can only be built through experience, through the repeated, ordinary, difficult practice of choosing not to explain, choosing not to defend, choosing not to seek the verdict, and discovering each time that you survived. Think about the people in your life who carry this quality, who make you feel in their presence that something in you can relax. You don't need to be defended around them, because they are not defending. You don't need to be careful around them, because they don't require management. You don't feel the subtle pressure that some people generate, the pressure that comes from being around someone who needs your approval in order to be okay. They are simply there in themselves, not asking anything of you in that particular way. And the relief you feel around them is the relief of encountering something solid in a world that often feels like it requires constant maintenance. What you are experiencing in those moments is not their confidence in the conventional sense. It is their completeness, the sense that they are already whole in a way that doesn't depend on your reaction. They will enjoy your approval if it comes. They will not disintegrate without it. Here is something that deserves to be said very directly. There are people who will be unsettled when you stop explaining yourself. Not because your silence is aggressive, not because you have become cold or dismissive, but because your explanations, all this time, have been serving a function for them too. When you over-explain, you give people leverage. You open the decision to feedback. You signal that the matter is still negotiable, that your position is subject to revision based on what they think. And some people, not maliciously, often without awareness, have built their relationship with you around that opening. When the opening closes, when you simply decide and move without submitting the decision for review, it can feel to them like something has shifted, like you have become less available, less manageable, and they may tell you that you have changed. They are right. You have. But what they mean by changed and what is actually true are different things. They mean, you used to let me weigh in on your choices. You used to adjust based on my reaction. You used to need something from me that I could give or withhold. What is actually true is, you have stopped asking for something that was never yours to ask for and never theirs to provide. The relationships worth keeping will adjust. The ones that were built entirely on the access your over-explaining provided, those may not survive the update. And that loss, while real, is not evidence that something went wrong. It is evidence that something went right. And that quality, that specific and rare quality, is available to most people. It is not reserved for some particular type of personality or some particular kind of background. It is available to anyone who is willing to do the slow, internal, unglamorous work of moving their sense of authority from outside themselves to inside. Not through performance, not through deciding to be different, through repeated experience, through letting disapproval arrive and discovering it doesn't destroy you, through saying the thing without the apology and finding that the sky stays up, through choosing yourself, quietly, consistently, without announcement, and building across time a self that can be chosen. And here is something that takes most people by surprise when they first experience it. When you stop explaining, conversations change. Not because you have become withholding, not because you have pulled back, but because the absence of the constant self-defense creates a different kind of space. A space that other people can actually enter. The over-explaining, for all its warmth and thoroughness, occupies a room. It fills every silence. It pre-answers every question. It closes every gap before it can be explored. And the people on the receiving end of it often don't know how to describe what's missing. but they feel it. That the conversation, despite all the information being shared, never quite reaches what it could reach. When the explaining stops, something different happens. The other person speaks more and differently because they are no longer receiving a prepared presentation. They are encountering something that hasn't been constructed for optimal reception, and encountering something real, something unmanaged, tends to make people more real in return. The non-explainer creates the conditions for genuine conversation simply by not filling all the space. The silence says, "I am here, and I am not afraid of what you will find." That is an invitation, the most honest one a person can extend. A man goes to a dinner and says very little for the first hour, not because he has nothing to say. He simply doesn't feel compelled to perform his presence. He listens. He asks a question when something genuinely interests him. He does not try to establish himself, to make the room understand who he is. At the end of the night, 3 different people seek him out to continue conversations he barely began, because something in his unperformed presence was legible to them as real. And real, in a world full of careful performance, is almost unbearably rare. Here is a truth worth carrying. The people who explain themselves constantly are not insecure people. They are people who have not yet gathered enough evidence that they are allowed to exist without permission. That evidence cannot be argued into existence. It has to be lived into existence. And it starts small. It starts with the text message sent without being read 4 more times. The no delivered without a paragraph of justification. The decision made without first imagining how to present it. The opinion stated without the row of qualifiers around it. The misunderstanding allowed to exist without immediate correction. None of these are dramatic. None of them announce themselves as the moment something changed. But they accumulate. And what accumulates is evidence. A personal record of having moved through the world from your own center and survived, more than survived. Found that the world, the real world, responds differently to a person who is not asking it for permission. Not always with approval, not with universal acceptance, but with something better than approval and more stable than acceptance. With the particular quality of attention that is given to someone who is genuinely, groundedly, unperformatively themselves. And over time, not all at once, not dramatically, the explaining becomes less necessary. Not because you care less about other people, not because you have become indifferent to their experience of you, but because you have become more interested in your own. You have become more interested in what you think, what you know, what you value, what you are building, and less interested in the ongoing project of managing how all of that is received. And in that shift, something opens, not loudly, not with fanfare, quietly, the way most important things open. A small, clear space where the constant self-defense used to be. And in that space, something that has been waiting a long time to be simply and fully expressed. Yourself, not the explained version, not the justified version, not the version that was carefully constructed to be palatable to whoever was watching. Just you, which it turns out was always enough. You simply were not in a position to know that yet.